Welcome back to Just Liberty, my friends, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the oldest and best religious liberty journal by far in the United States or anywhere. Well, together we're trying to take back liberty from the political extremes. Now, today, talking about extremes, we have a very prominent guest who wrote a book about the lack of religious freedom in China. And this is really an eye-opening interview. So, Bettina, go ahead and introduce our guest and let's get with it.
Today, we're delighted to be joined by Ambassador Sam Brownback. He is the former governor of Kansas. He's a former U.S. Senator and U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And he has a new book out called China's War on Faith. And this is taking a deep dive into the Chinese Communist Party's campaign against religious believers and what it reveals about the global struggle for religious conscience. Ambassador Brownback, welcome.
Well, thank you, Bettina. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, you have been working in this field for so many years, and your portfolio when you were at the State Department was the entire world. So why now are you choosing to focus in on China?
All roads lead to Beijing. When you're looking at persecution of people on human rights issues or the enabling of human rights abuses, most of this couldn't happen without a complicit Beijing. They may not be directly operating it, but they're allowing it, they're encouraging it, they're allowing it to be funded, they're not pushing back on any of it. And then it's such a central piece of communism that you have to control people of all faiths, all types of faith. And then they spread those tentacles out into their authoritarian sphere of influence that China has around the world. So we're seeing this, these virtual police states come up in lots of different authoritarian regimes now. And much of it was beta tested, developed, and deployed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, what is it about freedom of religious conscience concerns in particular that makes it such a challenge for totalitarian governments and why they want to crack down on religious freedom?
They cannot stand an allegiance that's higher than the government or them, period. They just, look, we are the decision maker. We are the authority. We are always right. And they cannot stand a challenge to that. And then they also, just in a very realistic way, religious people, they found over just years, are the ones that will actually stand up and fight and will actually die for their faith. If really pressed, that they will put their faith above their own lives. And that is just such a core challenge to a totalitarian state, particularly communism, that's officially atheistic, of course. God does not exist whatsoever, but is operationally atheistic. They cannot tolerate that level of allegiance that's above the government. Or else they find they have all sorts of control problems within their mechanism, which is why I argue in the book, I said, this is a strategic asset of the United States that we should really be using against this totalitarian expanding moment we're in, because we believe religious freedom is a fundamental cornerstone human right. They believe it's an existential threat. And 80% of the people in the world have a faith of some orientation. So we're with the people of the world. We should press it forward.
How much, if I may, Bettina, how much of this, suspicion of faith and religious freedom is kind of generic to communism or to authoritarianism? And in particular, in the Chinese context, I'm wondering, several decades ago, the Roman Catholic cardinal, perhaps inappropriately named Cardinal Sin, curious name for a cardinal, was instrumental in the Philippines in leading the opposition against Ferdinand Marcos, which ultimately resulted in his overthrow. And, I'm not a China expert, but, my kind of little brain gets going and thinking, well, if I were sitting in Beijing, I would, take a lesson from that to be very, very suspicious of any kind of organized power like religion that can pose an institutional threat to the government. Do you think that had much of an influence?
Yeah, absolutely, Alan. But I think it goes even more specific to communism than that. I think it goes to the fall of the Soviet Union and a pope named John Paul, who was Polish, who shows up in Poland behind the Iron Curtain and says, "Be not afraid," to a Polish population that is historically Catholic, but hadn't been to Mass in decades at that point in time. But he shows up and he says, "Be not afraid." And the people that were afraid and shaking in their boots were the communist leaders of Poland. And it wasn't long and it was done. It was over. They had lost it. And I really think the Chinese communists have studied that model and that fall. The Jewish refuseniks and what they did to undermine the authority of the Soviet Union, the evangelicals there at that time. And plus, communism seems to have about this 70-year life expectancy in a country. That by that point in time, they've just kind of, people in the country paid their dues to this authoritarian state. And the Chinese communists, I think, are trying to last this longer and extend this. And one of the key features is you have to control people of religion.
So controlling people of religion, why don't we dig into that a little more? When I visited China, I think it was about 15 years ago now, with a group of church leaders, we met with Chinese Communist Party leaders who were part of the Three Self movement, which is kind of the umbrella, is that right, for religion or Christianity in China. Can you give our listeners a sense of what it's like as a Christian believer to express your faith, to exist, to worship within communist China? What are the structures?
Well, the structures are really what you start to describe there. This Three Self movement is a government top-down controlled church. Now, it is a church in that there are people there that do believe and have fundamental beliefs in the Bible and God and deity that's there. But the structure itself has to answer within the government. It cannot ever be critical of the government whatsoever. The leadership has to all be vetted and controlled by the government within the church itself. The teachings have to comply. And then you may have read recently, in the past several years, the Chinese Communist Party tried to rewrite portions of the Bible to be more, in line with what they had of Christianity with Chinese characters, would be the way they would express it. Now, they really aborted some of the views, and I thought galling for an officially atheistic organization to rewrite Holy Scripture, but they think they ought to be able to appoint the next Dalai Lama as well, even though they're atheistic, and they think they have that right. But it's really about controlling religion and people of religion and being able to keep on top of them as well. If you start getting folks that have different ideas that are more in line with the faith and the government, they want to control it.
Well, it would seem to me that American Christians, if we know anything about persecution or repression in China, we've probably heard some stories of Christians. But there's a number of other faith groups who are suffering as badly or even worse than the Christians are in China. And you talk about that in your book, don't you?
I do. Because honestly, the Christians don't have it near as bad as, say, the Falun Gong, which is, kind of a spiritual blended movement of Buddhism and Taoism. I say it's what Grandma used to do in China. And the Eastern religions, is she just kind of had some synchronization going on, and it wasn't a problem. But a guy comes along, blends them together officially, and it just takes off. 90 million people adherents in 7 years when they allowed it to go in China. Because the Chinese people are a very spiritual people, as many populations are. Well, the Chinese Communist Party couldn't have any of that. So they came down like a ton of bricks on these guys and did things even like forced organ harvesting and literally tried to wipe them out. That's why I call it a genocide against Falun Gong, because they wanted to wipe these guys out. And then you have to control the Tibetan Buddhists, and that's a whole nother vein. They had one Communist Party chairman, Chen Quanguo, who originally was the party chairman over Tibet, mollified the Tibetan Buddhists, and then they moved him over Xinjiang to mollify the Muslims, which was a bigger, difficult population. And he put in what I think is the most diabolical and remarkable police state that was both virtual and actual in that Xinjiang region, full of concentration camps, over 1 million people in those, horrible persecution taking place. But then once you got out of prison, you were still in prison by the cameras everywhere and the tracking systems that were put in place. And that's the one that really scared me when I first saw it, because I thought this is the model for authoritarian regimes in this modern era of the technology that they have available today that they never dreamed they would have a generation ago.
You know, it's fascinating to me, the lengths that the Chinese Communist Party will go to control its religious populations, and some readers may look at the words organ harvesting and say, no, this can't happen. When you were US ambassador at large for international religious freedom, did you sort of have this process by which you were educated into the realities of religious freedom abuses in China that shocked you? I mean, all of this sounds just so horrific. How can it be real?
I had the exact same question and same doubts for a decade. When I was in the Senate, I would hear these Falun Gong practitioners come up and tell me about these things. And, you know, I'm going, yeah, I hear you. And they would give me the evidence and I go, okay. But it just sounded so diabolical that I cannot believe people can imagine and implement a system this bad, this horrific. This should make a medieval executioner blush. I mean, it's that bad. But then they kept coming up with the numbers. And then Sir Geoffrey Nice led an investigation by the British of what was taking place and just went through the numbers of the amount of organs that are harvested and transplants taking place annually in China each year. And they're going, you can't do the numbers without having some sort of forced system taking place. And I kept meeting with people and getting this data, and I was just going, this is happening. Plus, on top of all of that, the Chinese Communist Party has at their disposal the records to prove this false today. If they wanted to say, nope, doesn't happen, we will prove it to you, and they'll bring the records and they'll open it up. Here's how we do this, is that. They could prove it false today. They don't do it. They don't do it. And so you're going, the numbers, the situation. And then I interviewed a gentleman who had an organ harvested as part of a liver. I went, saw it, looked at the medical forensic reports on it, and then they were going into several years later to finish the rest of him off, and he got away. And he's the only guy I've ever found like that in the world. And you're hearing the story, and you're going, yep, it's happening.
I'm almost afraid to ask, what does happen to folks when they take the organs? Are they taking enough to kill them, or what happens?
In almost all situations, yes. There's just a death sentence given to Falun Gong practitioners, and that's some sort of treason charge that they'll put up or whatever it might be. And yeah, and you can harvest eyes, heart, lungs, liver, kidney, multiple organs. And then they have kind of a organ tourism they had for a while, where you could sign up. You need a kidney. You could sign up and get an organ, schedule it 5 weeks out, show up at a certain place, and they would get you kidney. And you know how hard it is in this country to get some organ transplant. I mean, you've got to wait years, most of the people I know. Then you can schedule it there. And you're just going, this is horrific. There was another piece of evidence on this. There was a senior party official who died, and they posted on the internet that he had passed away and this terrible thing. And they were kind of joking about, well, they weren't sure if who really passed away. They were either him or he had multiple transplants in him, who it was that actually died. Now, they took that post down pretty quickly, but you're just going, this is horrible, guys. This is horrible.
You know, you're reminding me, and this may be spurious, but I had heard that Falun Gong practice healthful living, and that's, they were particularly good fodder, if you will, for harvesting. It's not like their livers were, clogged from alcohol or tobacco or something. Is there any truth in that?
It's even worse than that. They decided that practice was so good they would extend it against the Muslim population and advertise this in Muslim world as these are halal organs that you can transplant. And when I first heard that, I was just going, that's sickening on so many levels. And then people from outside the world are participating in this and paying tens of thousands of dollars for an organ, which, of course, if you're in that condition, you'd spend whatever money you could to get an organ. But where did that come from? How did you get that? And then that's when you start to see places. Israel, I think, actually was the first place that started this of banning organ tourism to China, and praise God, they did that. I want to make one other point here that I've hit the Muslim world up a lot about, why don't you guys speak out more about what's going on in Xinjiang? This is a dominantly Muslim population, and they won't, and they haven't. And they say, the Chinese play rougher than we do. But it's the only country I've found in the world where you cannot legally name a child Muhammad. They ban, you cannot name a child Muhammad. And you're thinking, of the 50 majority Muslim countries in the world, do you want the lead nation of the world banning the most popular male name in your country? Does that tell you something? And should that warn you about that kind of leadership? And we aren't seeing that reaction yet.
So, Ambassador, let's look at that question about either the complicity of other nations in what's going on and how what's happening in China is bleeding out into other repressive nations. And you started the conversation with the technology of repression that China is exporting. Talk to us about that.
Well, the unfortunate thing about it now is you can now find the needle in the haystack with the technology. You can find the one guy or the one woman out there who's organizing a Bible study or is leading a group. You can do keyword searches on these things. They're all listening and tracking devices if you've got the correct things plugged in. And they can find Muhammad or Lord or Allah or God in trillions of names and data points in here and be able to find who the person is. And not only that, you can find the person that's originating it, and then you can find their network of people that they're talking to. And they started giving social credit scores and marking down your social credit if you went to the mosque, or if you can't fast during Ramadan, or if they catch you fasting during Ramadan, that could throw you into the concentration camps if you did that. But it also affects the people that you then talk to, because they get caught in the same lower social credit score that keeps you from getting the housing you want or not letting your children go to a school, can really just kind of ban you from society based upon a bad social credit score.
It strikes me that George Orwell lived and died too soon because his vision of the totalitarian society doesn't begin to deal with the reality that, we're seeing today.
I wish I could argue with you, but I really don't think I can. And it just gets more difficult. All these electric cars now, particularly coming out of China, these are watching devices if you've got them plugged in and connected right. I don't know if you saw recently, there's these electric lawnmowers that have sensing devices on it. And I don't want to see a spy behind every lawnmower, but there's just too much capacity and too much desire for that information and control. And then I've seen this too. When one party stays in control for too long, they think they're going to be there forever, and they're willing to push the envelope even further on the abuse of power. And the Chinese communists been there 70 years, think, hey, we're good. And so you just abuse the power more and more. And we're in a real struggle. I see this as a struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and Western civilization. Western civilization built on that Judeo-Christian ethic of the individual, dignity of the individual, created in the image of God, with unalienable rights. This is a foundational belief, and theirs is, no, the party is in charge. And even really now under Xi Jinping, you're really getting more of a Maoist ideology where it's not even really the Communist Party, it's Xi is the leader of it. And I had a guy explain that to me once, of the difference between communism and Maoism. He was a Nepalese guy. And he said, communism, you follow a party and ideology. Maoism, you follow Mao. And you're really getting back to, I think, the Maoism under Xi Jinping. He's a reincarnated Mao.
I'm glad you kind of turned the conversation in this direction, because I had wanted to a few minutes ago, because what I'm struck with is, despite, the arguments that we have in our system about whether or to what extent America is a Christian nation, there's no question that what you said, those values that derive from our religious and philosophical traditions, values of the individual being created in the image of God, having, inherent dignity and worth. In a place like China, my view from across the ocean is the individual is not, there is no ethos that values the individual the way that we do here. That, the value is the state, and, the individuals are there to serve the state. The idea that we have of, say, public servants, that our elected officials are here to serve the community and the nation. To me, it seems like what we're watching unfold is what happens when you completely, let go of all of those basic, I'll call them biblical values.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that, and it's just, I think it creates a horrible situation. The other thing, Alan, I think that's key to remember is under communism, the human is not treated, the human doesn't have a soul, doesn't have a spirit. The human is an economic entity. And that's all it is. The human being is an economic entity. And so, as long as you play in the economic lane and you work hard and you make money, okay, up to a certain point, we're going to be just fine with you. As soon as you veer off into following any sort of spiritual sense or any sort of a higher power or any life that's beyond this, we got a problem. Now, if you want to stay away from that area, and if you want to just leave that all alone, you and I are going to get along just fine. But that's, again, where you get back to this fundamental need in a totalitarian state, particularly communism, to control people of faith. Because you're operating in a terrain they want to completely exclude. And on top of that, the communists think they can just kind of buy you off. As long as the economy's improving, we're okay. We can buy the world off with cheap goods, and we can buy you off by bribing officials in third world countries. And everybody's fine because everybody is simply an economic entity. What a crude, horrible world that would be if that's the place we're gonna end up at.
Ambassador, you worked for many years at the highest levels of US foreign policy in the Senate, in the State Department. What makes this challenge so difficult and so resistant, I guess, to diplomatic efforts? Why have we not made more progress in improving human rights in China? I mean, because in other parts of the world, I know the US State Department has made inroads on this issue.
For a long time, just separation of church and state, and I think we had a fallacious viewpoint of that for a long period of time, where anything that the state did that talked about religion whatsoever was violation of church and state. And that's been swinging back now. They're going, no, we can work with religious entities. We can't establish a Church of America. You can't have a official body, which is clearly against the First Amendment. But I think there was just this nervousness, A. Then B, there was just a disregard from a lot of people at the highest levels of government of anything religious. They didn't think religious people were particularly helpful. A lot of people thought religions are the reason of all of the wars we have, so let's get away from religion. Instead of seeing that, most people have a faith orientation, you have to talk about that or address that if you're going to get them and their culture to move forward. Because most cultures are built on a religious set of values, whether it's the Indian culture built on Hinduism or the Islamic culture and the Muslim countries built on Islam. I mean, they're built on a religious set of values that are natural law in many of their senses. And I just think they didn't want to get in that space. But once they started to, then they say, oh, okay, this actually starts to address a lot of issues. And you get things like the Abrahamic Accords that come out that have a real kind of a theological basis to the underlying piece that the people then identify with. Then they kind of go, well, okay, I'm in the family of Abraham. You get the people coming along with you then when you go to the very root of their beliefs. And we should be doing that. And we should be using that in our now Cold War that we're in with communist China. And we're going to be in this for some period of time. And we should use it to communicate with the American public the importance of this long-term Cold War battle we're in.
Well, it at least my perception has been that religious liberty has kind of suffered as, a handmaiden of the kind of human rights policy overall. That, yes, we as a nation do at times emphasize human rights in our foreign policy to a greater or lesser extent, but that the more consistent theme is that economic policy or other types of policy interests tend to override, making advocacy for human rights and religious freedom kind of a junior partner and a tough uphill battle. Is that fair?
Yeah, completely. Until really the recent last 10 to 15 years, Alan, that was completely true. It was kind of a useful thing to use once in a while. Human rights talk about religious freedom. We rarely talked about. But then you started seeing, and particularly in the first Trump administration, people going, no. We're going to make religious freedom a cornerstone human right. And the theory being that if you can get this one set right, you can build freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, these others off of it, because this is the human right of the soul. This is the right that's closest to who you are as a person. And that started gaining some traction. The left pushed back. No, there's no hierarchy of human rights. There's a group of them. But that's gained more traction. What I'm pushing now is we shouldn't treat it as a human right. We should treat it as a global security issue. This is our best tool against totalitarianism. And we're with the people doing this. And you use this as a force. The military guys would call it a global engagement strategy. We're on bedrock on our foundational values on this one. We're always best when we lead with values, with our values. You got a bedrock one here, and it happens to go right at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party. And I contend, and I think it's absolutely true, they fear, the CCP, more religious freedom than they do our aircraft carriers or even our nuclear weapons. This one really gets at the core of their control mechanisms.
So given their determination to control religion in their own country, it seems to me that they're expanding their zone of influence in the world. And they're exporting this mindset, they're exporting the technology to support it to other countries. Can you talk a little bit about the other countries that are taking on a more Chinese model of relating to religion?
Yeah, I can talk about it, but I don't, they're not gaining hearts and minds. They're buying wallets, is what they're doing around the world. They're bribing their way into places with government leaders, other community leaders, and you can buy a person's allegiance for a period of time, but you don't get their heart and their beliefs. That's why I just think there's only so much of a runway that China has. I mean, look at Venezuela. It's kind of a classic of this one. Okay, the Chinese buy the top leadership. They get a bunch of oil out of there. You pull the top leader out of it, the oil starts flowing to here. You didn't get the Venezuelans' hearts and them saying, well, we love the Chinese system. We like the money. The leadership like the protection. No, they aren't there. I mean, that's why we've got our problems. But we should continue to push these basic values as things that that's what people really believe in and follow. And we've got to confront the Chinese Communist Party. And I want to say one other thing here. I love China. I love the Chinese culture. My wife and I adopted a young girl from China 25 years ago. She's a wonderful member of our family. This is not about China or the Chinese culture. This is about the Chinese Communist Party and a dictatorship that they want to use to run the world.
So we've been talking about this from a 30,000 foot level. Let's take it down to an individual level of someone here in America who may be listening to this podcast and thinking, well, that's happening over there. There's nothing I can do to respond here. What would you say?
I'd completely disagree with them. I've seen movements get going, and it can be a fifth grader class in rural Colorado that I've seen start global movements where people get interested in something. But people can pray. They can pray about changes that need to take place. They can speak up to their legislators. They can stop buying as many Chinese goods if these things are going to keep being used to finance these dictatorial governments and build up a military that's confronting ours. And then I think we just have to long-term start really preparing ourselves to break apart the world economically into a China sphere and a U.S. sphere. We're going to have to build our own supply chains in reliable places. They're going to have their set of countries that they work with. But I don't want a détente strategy that we did a long period of time with the Soviet Union where they're there, we're here. I want the Reagan strategy. We win, you lose. Because the world is just so communicative back and forth now. I think we've just got to put it in people's face, the differences between these two systems, and force them to choose which one they want to go with. But we've got to be prepared to maintain that sort of confrontation for decades, possibly, like we did against the Soviet Union. We need to against China. And it will be, as the head of the Tibetan government in exile told me one time, either we will change China or China will change the world. It's going to be one of those two. And China's got a pretty good head of steam, and I think they're much tougher than the Soviets ever were.
Well, that's a sobering thought on which to end the interview. But I hope that listeners will go and get Ambassador Brownback's new book, China's War on Faith. It is an eye-opening read, and I heartily recommend it. Ambassador Brownback, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, and thank you for what you do, Tina and Alan, and your organization. I just think you do get the core of really what this is about. Not trying to press anybody into my point of view, my faith orientation, but I want everybody to have the right to practice theirs and to follow their soul as they see fit. And so thank you guys for fighting for that. Keep doing it.
Well, this has been this discussion has been a real blessing, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure. God bless you all.
Bettina, that was certainly the most sobering interview we've ever done, maybe the very best. You know, I've been hearing these stories about the organ harvesting and all this over the years, but to talk with someone like Ambassador Brownback, who knows,
Yeah,
and who can talk about, you know, I mean, it's just so. I mean, both of us were sitting there shaking our heads like this really can't be happening, you know.
I used to attend, Alan, what we called the Religious Freedom Roundtable on Capitol Hill. We met every week, different organizations that dealt with religious freedom advocacy from different faith traditions, different perspectives. We'd all come together, and often Ambassador Brownback, as he was then, would come and he'd talk to us about different issues. I remember the day when I was sitting in the room and someone, a couple of young ladies, a couple of young Chinese ladies came in. They had papers in their hands and they were going around handing these papers out to everyone. And I remember looking at the paper, and it was a report on this organ harvesting. And I remember thinking, you know, some people just take things too far. I mean, this is just clearly, it is beyond belief. This is, you know, we have to keep within the bounds of reality if we're going to be effective in our advocacy. That was my attitude. Well, in the subsequent weeks and months, enough evidence came, you know, was discussed in our roundtable that was just compelling. There was firsthand witness testimony, enough documentary evidence to make you realize that this is not just some horror movie. This is reality. These are individuals who are being brutally used for their you know, organs and body parts. It is a horrific thing, and it surprises me that it hasn't got more publicity.
The question that I did not think to ask the ambassador, maybe it would have been embarrassing, I don't know, but it strikes me that our American record on human rights has eroded to an extent to where countries like China will issue condemnations of our record on human rights, and obviously for political purposes, because their record is obviously far worse. So I'm not trying to make a false equivalency here, but I do think that it's tragic. I certainly don't agree that any of our administrations have really made a sufficient issue of human rights. To my memory, the president who made, in my lifetime, who made it the biggest issue was Jimmy Carter. And of course, everybody mocks his presidency as an abject failure. But I think that there were some bright spots in his presidency, and this is one of them.
Well, the problem, Alan, is that when you try to tackle these issues of human rights through the mechanism of foreign policy, you really have a conflict of interest. I mean, you have two interests coming head to head, and you see that in the mechanisms that the US government has for monitoring religious freedom abuses around the world. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom issues this
Annual
reporting
report.
here, and it recommends sanctions against certain countries. Well, those sanction recommendations go over to the State Department, and it gets sort of filtered through their foreign policy interests, and then the report that is issued invariably gives a pass to countries where we have a very strong economic interest in keeping that good relationship with, or a military relationship that we're trying to preserve. And so you really can't effectively deal with human rights issues through that mechanism. It's a very blunt tool.
No, I get it. For 25 years, we were beating on Congress as a religious freedom workplace coalition, right?
Yeah.
And what we found was that both parties had different reasons, different agendas for why they weren't really interested in workplace religious freedom. So religious freedom advocacy is tough. And as much as, in some of our interviews, we find reasons to criticize the current Supreme Court, the reality is when it comes to protecting at least certain aspects of religious freedom, like workplace religious freedom, this court has been a blessing.
Yeah,
it's it's a mixed bag.
That's right. And like everything in this world of religious liberty, there's nuance. You can't really analyze things in terms of black and white, good and bad. You have to understand how messy this whole area is. I guess that's part of what we're doing here, Alan. We're trying to understand that.
Just what I was going to say in closing. We are trying to reclaim religious liberty, in what we call the sort of lonely middle from the political extremes.
Exactly.
So with that, we will bid our listeners farewell. I'm Alan Reinach with Bettina Krause. Until next week, remember, eternal vigilance really is the price of liberty.